Hello and welcome to ECS 6632, Research in Multicultural Education. I'm Andrew McLaren. I'll be leading you through this particular module. This particular module, titled Courageous Conversations About Diversity, will kind of serve as a model for future modules that you'll be working your way through, given the nature of the hybridity of the course, which is pretty much substantially all done online, and you meeting in small groups with only 2 face-to-face meetings. So you'll find that the modules will intersect between the readings that you'll be doing outside of class and your activities, and providing valuable lecture and information that isn't necessarily covered by the readings that we have assigned. Real quickly before we move forward, it's kind of essential that you as course participants have completed the Tech Readiness Survey, or the Technology Readiness Survey, provided you by the University of Utah. That will be really helpful in determining kind of where you are in your technological abilities, given the fact that this course requires a substantial amount of tech savviness, so to speak, in order to be able to kind of work through the different pieces. You'll find that every module will be similar to this module. Aside from the title slide, you'll have an overview slide that kind of walks you through the different components of each of the modules, kind of creating a framework for you as you move forward through the particular modules. And so briefly, just kind of an introduction, this particular module is going to kind of introduce you to this particular piece that we need to hit right away, and that is the courageous conversations about diversity. It's going to kind of set the table for us in terms of preparing us for the process of engaging one another in sometimes very difficult conversations, but important conversations nonetheless, in terms of moving forward in our attempt to reimagine the school and, in essence, the school system in some way, shape, or form to address these increasing issues associated with race, gender, and class. And so as you move into the next slide of this particular module, you'll find the overview for the module, and following with that will be several mini lectures to kind of get you keyed in on the elements necessary for kind of our first face-to-face meeting, and in preparation for kind of working within the groups that you're going to be working in for the remainder of this course. So let's move on to the overview slide. All right, moving forward, we're going to do a brief overview of the lecture that this particular module will engage in. And we'll have 3 key elements, but basically of those elements we're focusing on 2 major issues. The first of that you'll find was the bulk of the reading associated with this module to kind of set the table, so to speak, in terms of kind of the overall components of this course, but specifically this piece of critical conversations in the area of social justice. We all understand that schools are impacted by a variety of different elements, but ultimately being able to engage in these critical conversations around issues associated with race, gender, and class will be a key piece. And so it's important we kind of go through the process of ultimately what these critical conversations look like, as well as what it really takes in terms of ourselves and being able to step back in some circumstances to have those meaningful conversations. Another piece associated with that will be critical conversations, and especially when it comes to advancing the profession for us as educators, and how being able to engage in critical conversations, finding other like-minded educators who are willing to take the substantial risks associated with critical conversations to forward our profession, and ultimately have us be much more responsive to the needs of the changing demographics and the students that we find seated in our classrooms. Another key component of this will be obviously the St. Benedict's piece, and how we're going to use the St. Benedict School in New Jersey as a case study for reimagining the educational institution. We find over the decades school reform being a common both political and social point of conversation in the United States, as we attempt to address the ever-changing requirements of schools, what we want schools to do, at the same time understanding the significant demographic shifts in the United States and all of the major issues that tend to impact school and student success. And so St. Benedict's basically kind of gives us that piece to begin a conversation, understanding that there are limitations to the St. Benedict's model. And then finally, using St. Benedict's as an example of having a critical conversation, being able to use both the positive and negative components that we might find within the St. Benedict's piece, and maybe some of the elements we find within the conversations in the interview process that are engaged in by the principal actors and participants in that 60 minutes piece. And we can kind of tease out different elements that are found within that conversation as kind of an example of what it means to engage in a critical conversation around a piece of journalism that highlights a very successful school, but also some underlying elements that are found within that conversation that occurred in the piece, and being able to tease out what those complexities may be. So we'll move forward from here. Our next piece here is we're focusing on the critical conversations that we want to have in social justice and the realities that exist when it comes to discussing what can be at times very difficult and confrontational and uncomfortable topics associated with issues around race. And I think it's really important that we look at the first piece, which would be the intentional approach to critical conversations, that it isn't just entered into haphazardly, that we kind of lay a framework for those conversations. And in doing so, I'd like to point to Cornel West's piece from his seminal work, Race Matters, where West clearly articulates the need to be very intentional and specific in the approach to these conversations. And I'll quote Dr. West when he says, "How we set up the terms for discussing racial issues shapes our perception and response to these issues." West clearly articulating there that we have to approach it in a very intentional way with clear understanding of rules and what the goals are of those conversations. And we can look to experiences in American history of the past and attempts by a variety of different venues, from talk shows and other nightly news magazines and even cable news networks, where we see or obviously take account of a horrific chain of events, whether it be an event as recent as Ferguson, Missouri, or Trayvon Martin, or even something that seems as innocuous as Beyonce's Super Bowl performance, that immediately triggered a kind of cascade of conversations that politicized what may have been, or quite possibly was, a political act on her behalf, and how conversations around race and equity basically devolved into a sport of hurling accusations with no real meaningful progress being made across the political spectrum when it came to different areas of focus and concern. We can see that as far back as the 90s in New York City and the Central Park jogger case with the 5 young African American males that were all under the age of 18, arrested, ultimately prosecuted and found guilty for the brutal beating and rape of a young woman jogging in Central Park, and the firestorm that erupted around issues associated with race in New York City at a time where race relations were highly charged. And you find a variety of venues, whether it be the early Oprah Winfrey show or Current Affair, a Nightline, all attempting to engage in conversations. However, it was never an intentional approach. It was always highly politicized and sensationalized, and so we very rarely ever achieved anything meaningful from those conversations. Mainly because it wasn't intentional, and understanding there are very specific ground rules as laid out in Singleton and Hayes. And we talk about, they talk about the 4 agreements for courageous conversation, and that is, as you go through that particular reading, staying engaged and focused on what the ultimate goal of those conversations are. Also understanding that we should expect and you will experience discomfort there's nothing that creates comfort when we have to confront issues associated with race, gender, and class, and when those issues may challenge assumptions we have or challenge the way we see the world that we currently live in. The other piece that they discuss is speak your truth. We try not to hide or cloak the experiences or the beliefs and assumptions that we carry. And so therefore it's very important that we're honest in these conversations, knowing full well that our honesty can be uncomfortable for us as well as the other people in the conversation, but it's important to forward the conversation and create a framework for understanding each other within those conversations. And then finally, and the most important piece is expect and accept the fact that there may not be any closure to this particular issue or the topic of conversation around race and gender and class. Obviously, specifically for the purposes of this course, race being the primary component. But we can't expect to solve the issue at hand. Obviously, because we've been engaging in these conversations for decades, if not centuries, we have to clearly accept the fact that we, as a small group or a large group, are not going to resolve those particular issues in a 1 hour, 2 hour, or 10-hour course. But there's those conversations themselves that give us greater understanding and insight into how we create our understandings of race in those interactions within the institutions, specifically for us, the schools within which we work. The second is the internal struggles that we have and being humble in the face of the fact that there will be realities revealed by people that we engage in these conversations with that we didn't expect or anticipate. How we all move through this world affects the way we interact in that world and helps create our understanding of it. And so we've all created very different understandings of the world in which we live, specifically also around issues associated with race, and how we have structured those understandings in some circumstances may have been very different to how other people have. And when we find those assumptions we have made being challenged, it can be humbling. And we struggle with the fact that we may not know the world the way we thought we did. And being able to enter into those conversations and within those groups with a sense of humility opens us up to a greater level of understanding. Now, that's not to say that our understandings are wrong, but it helps us understand that the way we've shaped our understanding of the world may be very different from the other people within the group. And one of the other pieces is basically coming to terms with uncomfortable silences on both sides of the equation, and that people of color are going to, in some circumstances, feel a sense of silence because they may feel their voices are not being understood or heard. Likewise, people of the majority may also silence themselves and not want to share because they feel that they may have either engaged in an unacceptable practice or understanding because of what is revealed through the process of these discussions, that the way they ultimately have framed their understanding of race has ultimately led to them to having some type of discord with what might be the narrative of other people within the group. And that in many cases forces us into silence. And as such, because silence ultimately will negate potential for conflict. But I think that it's important, and both Singleton and Hayes have revealed that it's important to be okay with those and let those silences exist for a while as people have the time to process what is being said and shared within the group, and process the different perspectives and understandings of how race and in other circumstances gender and class are understood. But also recognizing those silences are an opportunity for us to explore our understandings or misunderstandings, as the case may be, and being able to, within a group, especially a group that we trust, ask further probing questions in order for us to better understand our assumptions or our understandings in that particular context. Now, moving on to the piece in terms of critical conversations and ultimately how this will serve our purposes in terms of advancing our profession as a whole. it's important that we kind of take a step back and kind of look at the profession of teaching as a whole and what these critical conversations ultimately mean for us when it comes to ultimately creating what I like to term these intellectual professional communities. And that all of us have some experience in one way, shape, or form within the school in kind of finding fellow educators who tend to support our particular framework and understanding as what our role is within the classroom. And while that can be very supportive, there are certain types of communities within schools and those educators that we understand in some circumstances don't necessarily align with our particular philosophical frameworks and pedagogy when it comes to our role in education. And in many cases, it's those types of critical conversations that we engage in as we find educators that seem to be like-minded, and we probe the perimeter of their particular pedagogies and their philosophical frameworks, eventually finding those individuals, we would hope, where we can really take the type of risks that we previously discussed in the piece on critical conversations, to have meaningful conversations about issues present in our particular classroom, in our particular school, and potentially in our particular community, and ultimately using those conversations to be a springboard to ultimately inform the type of educational communities we want to have within our school. And by doing or engaging in these conversations, they ultimately we can create a support network of not only like-minded individuals, because obviously we should understand that these critical conversations are not engaged in order to find consensus, but in that space of feeling safe and being able to really work through, in some circumstances, very difficult and challenging issues along race, culture, and class, we ultimately can support each other, and we tend to create an environment where we can raise the bar and really get at specific issues that maybe, and this might not be intentional, that our administration, department chairs, or even our school district might not necessarily be completely in tune to, simply because of the realities of politics and communities outside the school that tend to use a very broad focus in an attempt to reform the school or address particular issues. And why this is important in terms of the profession is we really step beyond just the kind of teacher workroom or teacher break room conversations about pedagogy or lesson plans. It becomes a much greater philosophical conversation, but it's embedded within the very school that we work. And in many cases can become directed in a form of action within our classrooms, our hallways, and our school. What kind of dovetails in with that particular piece on these intellectual professional communities, we also see these critical conversations ultimately playing a part of advancing our particular profession, in that we really become much more philosophical practitioners when it comes to our particular pedagogy in the classroom. Now, we all tend to understand that we are very skilled in terms of structuring and creating the lesson plans that we use and the overall educational foundations for why we do what we do within the classroom. However, it is believed, and I tend to be one of the particular individuals that believes this, that through this process of engaging in these conversations, we tend to broaden the understanding of what factors go into our particular practices within the classroom, and ultimately branching out above and beyond what are the traditional classroom practices and frameworks for how we structure our particular lesson plans and our lesson plan designs. And that engaging in these conversations, we find that these greater pieces associated with social justice find a way to not influence, but be taken into consideration in terms of how we structure our overall pedagogies. And being able to then, going back to the previous piece on these professional communities that we're a part of, we can be much more reflective and share those particular experiences and concerns that we have in terms of what we may or may not be doing within our classroom, and those concerns. In some circumstances, I find as a practitioner that I may be doing harm. One of my biggest concerns has always been if I am silencing particular communities within my classroom, or not understanding or seeing an entire component of a student's particular set of circumstances. And having those particular communities that I feel safe in and that I can ultimately turn to in an attempt to create even greater insight and understanding, and obviously being able to share my successes, but particularly my failures or perceived failures, is essential. And that it only comes about as a result of engaging in critical conversations, taking those particular risks, and identifying individuals within my professional community at my school, or in some cases even at adjacent schools within my district or even outside of my district. It tends to lend itself to the educator, I feel, being much more philosophical in terms of how they apply a particular set of classroom practices and the overall kind of pedagogy of their classroom. That too has a greater implication in terms of seeing ourselves not only as solitary actors within the classroom, but moving beyond that and connecting, whether it be down our hallway or across our school, and even very specifically to our administrators in an attempt to kind of pull them along in particular directions that we feel are necessary, that the admin, through no fault of their own, may be unaware of, or in some circumstances feeling incapable to address those particular issues. And we can find throughout schools and classrooms educators who do engage in this particular practice. And the more we engage in these critical conversations, the more we find ourselves as these philosophical practitioners of not only the profession of teaching, but also within the overall institution of the school and the schooling system. And this final piece, educators as institutional agents of change, and how that relates to this piece of critical conversations in advancing the profession. It lends itself to some of the conversations that have been ongoing over the last several decades, associated with educators being empowered to affect substantial change, whether it be in society, individual students that may come into our classroom. All of that is relevant in some way, shape, or form. But this piece, in essence, kind of rejects, in some ways, a lot of the literature that came out of the 60s and 70s that might be seen as embedded in a lot of Marxist rhetoric as teachers as these massive agents of overall societal change, and ultimately affecting wide range change across American society, deeply rooted in somewhat revolutionary rhetoric. I think it's more important that we look at this in the standpoint of the critical conversations ultimately allowing us as educators, going back to the first point, as intellectual professional communities, to ultimately bind together along those ideological lines that we find ourselves in agreement with, or at least not necessarily agreeing to particular aspects, but agreeing that some type of course of action needs to be taken to address specific concerns that we may see within our classrooms, our hallways, or our particular institution. In that these very critical conversations give us insight into the specific types of actions that we may want to engage in. Another piece to that is the understanding that these conversations, as they take place, in some circumstances really only are reflective of our particular community itself, whether it be the community that our school serves, or even on a small level, the community of teachers within the institution. And in these conversations, it becomes evident that in kind of that rejection of the 60s, early 70s rhetoric, that we are not here to engage in substantial wholesale change of the entire educational system in the United States, specifically focusing on the particular issues and elements that we identify and reveal through these conversations we engage in with our fellow educators, we find those areas of agency where we can engage in specific acts to ultimately affect change within our institution. And again, it's key here to understand that it's not, the focus is not a large-scale systemic change. As we look at something like St. Benedict's, the institution changed, but the institution was not making any attempt at a broader wholesale change, even across the Catholic education system in the United States. It was a very specific example that we'll be getting to in conversation in the following slides. But key here as a part of advancing the profession is that educators become very active and involved in the discussions around whether it be pedagogy or policy or teacher practices, and that in most cases can be informed by these conversations that we're willing to engage in, going all the way back to the beginning of this particular piece on critical conversations, and therefore giving teachers a substantial amount of at least agency as well as voice within the institution to affect some elements of change that in the long run can turn into substantial elements of change in a desire to meet, once again, the changing needs of the community we may serve and the changing demographics of the student body that we find within our classrooms. And finally, I just want to kind of provide an example of a conversation that occurred, surprisingly, at my school during lunch in the teacher break room. There's a consistent number of participants in the teacher break room. I would say we go from anywhere between 5 to, in some circumstances, 15 individuals eating lunch in a pretty limited space that we have available to us. And we're all pretty familiar with one another, but yet there are a variety of different ideological and philosophical orientations found within that particular lunch group. And on this particular day, the issue of gender identity came up, considering that we had 3 separate students at the time who were very gender fluid, in that from one day to the other they might identify male or female. And this, of course, is an ongoing development in public schools, and specifically in Utah. And decidedly so. I think educators in some circumstances are rather vexed by the process involved. One of the teachers in particular was airing their frustration with the fact that the administration had, through the counseling center, had issued some standard practices to teachers that had these particular students in terms of keeping the classroom welcoming and also being able to facilitate those students' gender identities for those particular days. Now, if you're not familiar with how that might play out in the classroom, a particular student may come in one day identifying male and the next day identifying female. And as an educator, we're asked to basically accommodate that and being willing to engage that particular student by virtue of whatever gender they're identifying with that particular day. This one particular teacher, who I would be willing to admit is very responsive, tries to be as accommodating as possible, but on this particular day was very frustrated and was basically articulating a point of view that students should in some way, shape, or form inform the teacher when they came into the classroom or dress a particular way. This teacher was asking, well, why don't the students simply just dress like a boy or like a girl so it's easier for the teacher? And the conversation at the lunchroom table really started to slow down as people started to pay closer attention to the conversation she was having with a few of the other educators. And around the table, some people who traditionally don't participate in the conversations that our end of the table did started kind of spouting off their own particular views in regards to gender identity and homosexuality and other issues associated with gender and sexual preference. And so it was clear that the conversation was not going to move in a direction that was going to be meaningful, especially for this teacher who was struggling with this particular issue. And so, it kind of took myself and one of the other educators to steer the conversation away from political beliefs, political positions, and back towards this idea of, as teachers and within our practice, regardless of who students are, what their particular political, philosophical, or even sexual orientations may be, that our job to be successful educators is to ultimately create a welcoming classroom. And even the educators who simply kind of wanted to engage in a back and forth banter about whether it was right or wrong, or the negative impact it might have on a classroom practice, or how confusing it might be for the other students within the class, we were able to, by kind of creating a safe space, and say, well, let's look at this from the standpoint of the student and from the standpoint of what our goal is as a school. And that, of course, is for the obviously the academic success, but also the emotional support of our students, regardless of whether or not we might agree or even understand these very complex issues, specifically in this particular case with gender identity. And after a while, the bulk of the table kind of really started to take a step back and have these conversations and even ask questions in terms of almost like a session geared towards coming to some kind of common consensus on what would be in the best interest of these particular students, while at the same time facilitating ease for not only the student themselves, but also the teachers, in attempting to accommodate the student, but at the same time make it understandable and easier for the educator to understand what was being asked of them. And I just didn't want to get into too much of the detail regarding that, but what it took was ultimately taking a step back and understanding that this was no longer an opportunity to kind of sound off on political beliefs, and more so to move forward in a direction to make some meaning, specifically for a teacher who was looking for guidance and looking for some direction in terms of how to address this particular issue. And this teacher even revealed their own kind of hang-ups on the practice, but yet still understood eventually, especially after a considerable conversation at the table, why it is necessary in those circumstances that we be willing to set aside some of our preconceived notions and some of our own particular hang-ups in the classroom when it comes to the welfare and well-being of our students. And so that's just kind of a very small window into what these conversations could look like. And from that, everyone walked out of the lunch that day, I think, by having a better understanding of these pressing issues that we will probably only see as educators with increasing number as more and more students become comfortable with revealing or at least engaging in conversations to address issues that they may be dealing with. So that's just a kind of a small, very limited example of how these conversations ultimately can take place. Right now we turn our attention to the example of St. Benedict's, as previously mentioned. At this point, you should have watched the 60 Minutes piece on St. Benedict's in Newark, New Jersey. And we want to just use it simply as a springboard for discussion in terms of the potential and possibilities that can be achieved in a school, even though St. Benedict's is a little bit different from what we generally deal with here in Utah within the public school system, St. Benedict's obviously being a Catholic school. Catholic schools still fall under the bureaucracy of the Catholic Church and its branch of its parochial education. And so while we too deal with the bureaucracy, obviously St. Benedict's is somewhat different. But it serves as a case study in what can be achieved when a school like St. Benedict's decides that it, in its original incarnation, is not meeting the needs of its students or obviously the community in which it's situated. St. Benedict's was able to, in essence, reinvent itself in a way that's very different from most Catholic schools as well as public schools, and it's achieving amazing results after having done so. One thing to keep in mind, obviously, that for us, schools are state institutions, that we in public schools are beholden to tax dollars, state legislatures, in some cases very substantial bureaucracies in some of the larger school districts like Granite, Jordan in Salt Lake District and Developing District in Davis. We ultimately realized that that may have restrictive components to it. That nonetheless doesn't mean that we can't engage in substantial reform in some way, shape, or form within those hierarchies, and specifically those bureaucracies. It's important to kind of draw our attention to the fact that St. Benedict's had reached rock bottom with its closure as a result of, the decision to close the school as a result of the riots in Newark in the 60s. And it should be noted that that rock bottom status with declining enrollments, because the school no longer met the needs of the community. The changing demographics of Newark ultimately changed the overall mission of the school, and when it was relaunched very different from what it had been before. And we really should ask ourselves, what could ultimately be achieved within the bureaucracies that we deal with, knowing full well that those bureaucracies aren't necessarily going to let us hit rock bottom. They're not going to watch a school dwindle and diminish until its enrollment drops to a point where the school has to be closed. And so districts obviously have an investment in that school, but the one thing that we should consider within public education is what we can achieve regardless of these substantial bureaucracies, in the same way that St. Benedict's is achieving success, as well as many other models that we could find across the United States of very successful school reform movements. I think the final piece is understanding the restrictive nature of school reform. We do compete with different conceptions of what schools should be doing for our students, what we as educators should be doing within our classroom. And as such, what we might want to do could ultimately be stymied by other forces. That doesn't, however, mean we don't attempt to engage in those types of reforms. And that there's a lot to be said for ultimately making those attempts, knowing that it may not work the way that we want it to work, but that doesn't necessarily mean we abandon the entire process. But it is very important to note that we, in many cases, may encounter significant roadblocks to achieving the results. And finally, especially with St. Benedict's, it's vitally important to note that St. Benedict's reopened in 1972. This news piece on the 60 Minutes was 2016. And so we generally can assume that St. Benedict's did not achieve immediate results like we're seeing today at St. Benedict's. And what that does to us, for us, is inform our understanding that the reform that we may engage in may not have significant payoffs until several years down the road. And I think that one of the most frustrating components of school reform is a desire on behalf of many people, whether it be teachers, administrators, or superintendents attempting to reform, who want to see immediate results, as opposed to really understanding that systemic change is going to be long-term, and we're going to have to be willing to entrench and work to see that reform achieved, and not expect that in 3 years we're going to have a substantial shift in positive graduation rates and or test scores. And so that ultimately we need to kind of keep that in mind as we look to move forward with any type of school reform. And then finally, using St. Benedict's as a point of departure from traditional paradigms. They've obviously shifted entirely their focus of the school, but also maintaining some very standard practices. But again, the point here is to use St. Benedict's as a point from which we can then move forward and discuss what can be achieved within the public school systems that we may be working within and teaching in. And finally, I'm going to ask that you sort of hit the pause button here on this particular module and revisit the 60 Minutes piece on St. Benedict's prior to advancing forward to the next slide. Because the next slide is going to basically walk us through a critical conversation regarding St. Benedict's as a model and a standard for what we might look to pursue in education. And I want you to key in on some pieces here, and potentially, what some of the assumptions are that we see the interviewers for 60 Minutes, as well as the subjects of the interviews, and some of the assumptions that they make in terms of the population of students who are attending St. Benedict's and potentially the larger community outside of St. Benedict's. And some of the key themes here that you should focus on are, first, agency and empowerment. What role the institution plays in that it provides a sense of agency for these young men while also potentially empowering them. And another piece there would be the advocacy versus, in some cases, we see this issue of salvation, school as saving these young men versus potentially seeing itself as simply being an advocate for the young men who attend St. Benedict's. And to go along with that idea of salvation versus empowering, where do we see these conversations taking place? How do we find the different subjects of the 60 Minutes piece kind of walking around these different frameworks, and especially looking at St. Benedict's through a very critical lens, as discussed earlier through these critical conversations. And then finally, focusing on a framework within Western institutions that can be based upon some of what we see here potentially at St. Benedict's, what St. Benedict's does well, and maybe what St. Benedict's may be falling short of in terms of its overall view of its student population and the community in which it serves. So there's some key pieces that I would ask that you can revisit the 60 Minutes piece and really focus in on those particular elements. Again, agency and empowerment, advocacy and salvation, or versus salvation, I should say. Salvation versus empowerment, and then kind of what St. Benedict's can do for us in serving as a framework within Western institutions overall, that traditionally, if we look at a lot of the literature, schools were always positioned, or have been positioned in some circumstances, as an institution of salvation, saving students and communities from themselves, and ultimately, on top of just the educational process, but other social and cultural components that work their ways into specifically public schools. So if you would just quickly pause, revisit the 60 Minutes piece, and then pick up the next slide in the conversation, specifically the critical conversation surrounding St. Benedict's. Finally, using St. Benedict's as a point of critical conversation, and specifically, we need to kind of take a step back. And while the 60 Minutes piece was clearly attempting to have us come away from the St. Benedict's example feeling that there are schools that are doing very good work within communities that typically, or more importantly, stereotypically, have not seen high levels of achievement, specifically a community like Newark with a very high minority population between African Americans and Latino students. We have to address the fact that even in that piece that is working to be very positive, there were very specific assumptions of race, culture, and class, and that the community like Newark and the students who attended St. Benedict's brought with them notions or elements of underachievement or some form of cultural disability, and that the school itself was responsible for fixing those particular pieces. Similar to that, there are assumptions associated with poverty that we find throughout the piece that may not be relevant, or specifically may not actually be the case. Clearly, we can work from stereotypes and assuming that Newark itself and the public schools themselves and the community were failing in meeting the needs of these young men. However, that can't be used as a method to dismiss the abilities that these young men already had, and that the school itself was not fully responsible for the success that these young men achieved. And that has to be addressed in these types of cases. we also have to understand the institutional independence that St. Benedict's has as a foundation for change, and why they were able to do what they did and are continuing to do at St. Benedict's. In that you look at the headmaster who, from its reopening in the early 1970s, understood the connection that the St. Benedict's had to the community. And while the stereotypical clientele, which had been white, working class Catholic and middle class Catholic young men, had shifted over to an entirely new population, he was given a substantial amount of autonomy because he and several of the other monks within that parish decided that they weren't going to let the school close. And we have to address that fact as a component of hitting rock bottom, as previously mentioned, and St. Benedict's basically being able to work from the ground up and reimagine itself as being responsive to the community it served. The other piece that was somewhat brought out through the course of the 60 Minutes piece was that there's a tremendous amount of student agency and empowerment that was being given or granted to the students at St. Benedict's. But again, where the 60 Minutes piece may miss the mark is really clearly articulating that many of these students already had that agency and empowerment, but the institution itself created the correct venue for them to be able to express that. And so that we have to, again, make sure that we don't bring a particular set of conceptions that just because these young men come from poverty and from minority populations, that they don't already have these inherent abilities when they came to the school. The school simply provided a different opportunity than potentially the public schools, which may very clearly not be serving their interest, or may not be the right venue for these type of young men. We cannot work from assumptions that they didn't already have inherent abilities, that the school itself was not fully responsible. And finally, what I find the most interesting component is the idea of let them fail, that failure is an open door to change. And while in many cases it's anathema to education to think that I'm going to let my students fail, or in some circumstances let an institution fail, let a policy fail, as an open door to then really step through that and look to institute substantial change as a result of that. Clearly, from the standpoint of the young men, being able to see their own failure, as the headmaster articulated, and that sometimes you're going to have to let young people fail in order to fully understand what's going to be required of them to be successful. And where St. Benedict's really started to embrace that particular mantra, regardless of the fact that in education we don't necessarily want to see students fail. We don't want to have students, especially like St. Benedict's, that have a considerable amount of control over the day-to-day activities of the institution. We don't want to see them fail in those policies, procedures. We have to understand that from failure comes a substantial amount of growth and understanding, and being able to reevaluate and assess why ultimately a particular program, a particular policy, or set of ideas that the young people of St. Benedict's may have come up with, and being able to evaluate why something failed lays a substantial amount of foundation for then growth, and being able to then problem solve and develop new solutions and possibilities and potentials. And in some circumstances, that may also mean allowing a student to ultimately fail a course, to fail a class, as the case may be.